little quieter. All right, good morning. How are y'all doing? Good. Well, it's good to see y'all. Of course, we are still on for week 2 of Christ and Culture with Dr. Bashart. So I'll go ahead and just introduce him and we can go ahead and get started for today. Last week we started just kind of introducing this idea of what are different modes of thinking about how we can engage with culture, kind of 5 different ways for thinking about that. And so today we're going to continue that question of how do we actually engage with culture and what could that look like for us here at the Bridge. So without further ado, Dr. Bashart. If you want it, you can have it.
Okay. Very good. Morning.
Good morning.
Good to see you again. Those of you who are here again. Those of you who aren't here because you were here last week, well, Lord bless you. That's great. Let's begin with a word of prayer. Father, we thank you for your many, many good gifts. And this morning, we thank you for the ability to be together, to have a time and place and opportunity to be with brothers and sisters in Christ. And we acknowledge your presence. We thank you for your presence, and we acknowledge our need for you. And ask that your Spirit would guide each one of us and guide us together in mind and heart. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, good to see you. Have you ever had a plan for something and started into it and realized, you know what, that plan needs some adjustment? Well, that's what I've had with the class. And this isn't about you, it's about me. Meaning, as I had this great idea kind of for how we go through this, and I just got into it and realized, yeah, that's not going to work. So don't worry, we're not going to do a U-turn, we're not going to make a 90-degree turn, and you might not even notice the turn, because it's my thoughts about what we do and how we'd approach it, and just to say, I've made some tweaks in that this week. So I hope those tweaks will be beneficial. So this is what we'll do today. I want to do a bit of review because I think last week was a little bit like the proverbial fire hose. Kind of blew through a lot of things quite quickly and without really as much opportunity for discussion of certain things as I think would be helpful. So I want to do a little bit of review. For those of you who were here, I gave a kind of a homework. I gave a question for you to think about, give some thought to, and I want to have a chance to kind of debrief that. So if you did some thinking about that, and by the way, I'm going to put it up here on the screen so you don't have to totally remember it, but if you did something about it, I want to give you a chance to share with the rest of us some of the thoughts you had. For those of you who were here, you may remember there were kind of 5 models or approaches, and we went through 4 of those. I want to just kind of finish what we started by briefly introducing that 5th approach, and with that, kind of bring to a conclusion the first part of our times together, which was to think about approaches to Christ and culture. And then to begin part 2, which is to talk about some specific issues. And that's probably where I've made the most changes, at least myself, in how we'll approach that. But that's what we'll do. So this is our agenda for the morning. So by way of a little bit of review, basically 2 things. One is to just really kind of reinforce the idea that Christianity is always cultural. There's a very appealing notion, and I have a book where in the early chapter, I kind of go at this a bit. There's a very appealing notion of, well, I don't belong to any tradition or anything. I'm just a plain Christian. We just believe in, just plain Christianity. And all I can say is that doesn't exist. It never has existed. It will not exist. The Apostle Paul wasn't just a plain Christian. The Apostle Peter wasn't just a plain Christian. There has never been just a plain Christian. Because Christianity is an incarnated, earthed faith. When God saves us, He doesn't extract us from the world. He gives us new life in this world. And in this world, you and I are embodied creatures who live in space and time. And because we live as embodied creatures in space and time, it means our Christianity will be reflective of that embodied life in space and time. And that's what I mean when I say it's cultural. And I use this as just kind of a prompting image that each one of these, in addition to whatever theological views they might represent, they reflect all kinds of cultural perceptions, understandings, and ways of communicating who Jesus is, what Jesus is like. And the fact that they're cultural is not bad or wrong. It is. There's no way not to be cultural. So that being the case, it's important for us to be wise and discerning about how we are, if you will, culturally, the cultural character of our faith. The second, and this is where I want to give you a chance to maybe ask questions, to have a little discussion that we didn't take time for last week, and that is these four approaches that we thought about together. I'm not going to go back and walk through each one, but this is kind of a brief prompter of each one. And so let me just ask questions that you have. If you can remember maybe a question you had last week that you didn't have a chance to ask, or if there's a particular view or concept that particularly troubles you, or that you think has potential, or that you just have a question about. Yes?
My question is, I was trying to apply the homework, was are we viewing which state it is in terms of, are we evaluating what the culture is, or are we evaluating where we are as a Christian individual?
Yeah, good question. Just in terms of bandwidth, amount of time and energy we have together, I'd like us to kind of focus on ourselves. The question of how are we to live in relation to our culture. Now, what's just wise in your question is, in order to do that, we have to understand a little something about our culture, right? If the challenge is to live as faithful Christians today in the time and place that God has placed us, in order to do that, we have to be somewhat aware of and have some understanding of our culture, right? If I heard your question, as far as our time together and where we really focus, I'd like us to be asking ourselves the question, again, kind of echo Francis Schaeffer, how then ought we live? How shall we then live in early 20th century metro Denver? Any reactions to this? Questions about any of these four views? It's a lot. Yes?
Well, as I was thinking about the homework, and I'm looking at the bottom category there.
Okay.
It seems like there's a difference between and I don't know if this is behind that thinking or not, but the difference between thinking the culture might be bad and will remain so versus nature, like creation,
Okay.
but is as a God-given reality,
Right.
and culture, which is kind of a man-shaped reality.
Exactly.
So are we looking at nature or are we looking at culture? What do you
Good.
say?
Good. Yeah. Very. Very good observation. And this is specifically about culture. And culture is one of the ways people will define culture is. So there's a whole body of literature just trying to define what culture is. One of the recurring themes is culture is basically the outcome of human interaction with nature. I mean, that sounds incredibly simplified, but this used to be part of a tree. Humans don't make trees. Trees are a part of creation. But humans ask the question, let's design something to sit on. Right? We as this doesn't come out of heaven. This is the result of human interaction with the created order. And part of God's creation are trees, and humans over time have learned about and thought about ways to use trees, God's gift in creation, to fashion it in ways to meet a human need or a human desire. And so there's wood, and there's all kinds of things that have been done with that wood that aren't done in nature, with the result of helping to build this chair. This is culture. This is culture because there are some cultures where if you and I were meeting like this, we wouldn't be sitting on these things. We'd be sitting on the floor. We might be sitting on grass. We might be sitting on mats. If you've traveled much, you know that when you go to the bathroom, not everybody has porcelain toilets like we have, right? All of those differences are culture. They all represent different ways that human beings are, to your point, kind of interacting with the created order that God has given us. So the emphasis here, the focus here is specifically on what is it that humans have done and are doing with the creation that God has given us. Yeah, Tyler, I think you had. Yeah.
Why? This is related to just a thought on the transformer. It was interesting. I was thinking about it, like both the left and the right side of those approaches.
Yes.
The two on either side really assume that we should just let culture go. It's bad, let it go. There's not much we can do. It's good, let it go. I don't need to change much. The middle, though, is the only one where it seems like we have an active role in changing things, or at least things can be changed.
Things can be changed. Yeah.
But what I thought was interesting about it is that even within that, there's so many different ways to think about how do we actually transform.
Mm-hmm.
Is it through top-down power
Mm-hmm.
in government? Is it through bottom-up relationships with individuals?
Mm-hmm.
The ways
Yes.
that you do, the ways that you transform are endless.
That's right. That's right. And your reference to, for example, top-down versus bottom-up. So one of the ways where there's been a very significant difference in that regard has been over the last 50 years in the United States. People who've looked at our culture and said, America's going to hell in a handbasket. And America's going to hell in a handbasket. What should we do? How should we respond to this? Well, among conservative, theologically, culturally, biblically conservative people, two of the reactions, and these two are quite different, but in the way Tyler alludes, one has been, we need to elect Christians to Congress. We need to elect Christian governors. We need to, get into the State House and change the laws. Other people have approached it saying, you know what? The only way anything changes is when an individual person is born again and they're renewed. And so what we need to do is, frankly, evangelism. One by one, we need to see God redeem people and save people. Those are two very different approaches that share a lot of common ground. They both believe that, again, to just put it this, America's going to hell in a handbasket. They both believe that the answer is that people live in accord with God's design and God's laws and God's intentions for humanity. They agree on that. What they disagree on, in some cases, not everybody, is that the one says, we need to bring about the change by changing the laws, changing the tone of the government. Someone else says, hey, we need to see individual people's lives transformed. And when enough people's lives are transformed, things will change. That's just two different strategies, you could say, in some sense, that share a lot of common ground theologically. Yes, sir.
It seems like one of the big difficulties is on the margins. What's the line that you want to say you cannot cross, and perhaps we'll get into that in the of. But even between the transformer and the above, corrupted but can be redeemed, a different assumed good, there needs to be a criteria for which parts of culture are good, and you get a lot of I'm real sympathetic to Wright, Tim Keller,
Okay.
and they get a lot of criticism for the places they go.
Yep.
In using culture or embracing culture.
Yes.
So that it seems like a really hard question.
Yeah.
What's the criteria for when you've gone too far?
So I don't know that we'll answer the criteria, but I'll just say in a couple minutes, I want to come back to your reference to part. You talked about parts of culture. And we'll loop back to that in a couple of minutes. Yes?
It seems like using the example you gave in the above column of
Yes.
two different groups, how they approach it. And the question was, how do we save America? How do we save American culture? That seems like the wrong question for us as Christians to
Okay.
be asking. That's not the goal. The goal is to advance the kingdom of God, to be involved in what God is doing. So it seems like when we ask that question, we're off base in the first place.
That's a very astute observation, spot on, and it's very significant. You're right. And in using the illustration I gave, I wasn't necessarily endorsing either approach. I was just describing approaches, but a further kind of analysis of those two approaches is that even the goal? Is that what should be at the center of the work of this church? To save America, to make America a Christian nation again. Is that what the mission of the bridge is? Okay, so two sidebars here. First of all, can those of you back by the windows hear me? Can you hear me? Okay, good. Then I'm going to stay off mic. The other is, and this is part of my recalibration that I alluded to at the beginning of the class today. My primary goal, and this may disappoint or frustrate some of you, and if it does, I apologize, but my primary goal in these 3 weeks is not to solve a bunch of Christ and culture questions and have us all leave with having figured out what to think about church and state, and what to think about genetic engineering, and what to think about media. What I hope to do is much more modest than that, which is to get our wheels turning on how to think about those kind of questions. Those kind of questions we're going to all have to be working on for a long, long time. And as the culture shifts and changes, we're going to have to think afresh. And so just the kind of thinking you are doing right here is exactly the kind of thing I want to invite us into, to engage in, and recognizing after this class is over, each of us as individual Christians and the bridge at church will need to continue as a church to be thinking about these things. Well, that's just in the interest of time. That was to get us kind of back to last week and review some of that. So the homework, metaphorically speaking, was to identify one culture question or issue that you find particularly important or particularly troubling. And we did a little bit of this last week, and I'm going to remind us of what those things were in a bit. And then as you reflect on your reaction to it, which of the four approaches do you think you are inclined to take? Now that's a big, complex matter, but I'm just wondering if anybody over the course of this week gave any thought to this. Yes.
Yeah, I did.
Okay.
And the problem that I identified is just one that we're living with constantly.
Okay.
An increased lawlessness and acceptance of lawlessness on an individual level, and car thefts and all kinds of things that are now the norm.
Okay.
And incivility one to another. My first. Did you want to know what box I put it in?
Yeah, and let me also just give a sidebar here. As we're going to see in a little bit, these 5 approaches that I'm going to delineate, whether or not any of us recall the names of these 5 categories, again, they are a tool toward an end to give us some prompts and resources to think about these things. So, but okay, yeah. In fact, you know what I think I did? I actually put that as the thank you. Yeah. So
I tend to put it in the paradox box.
The paradox box, okay.
Because not that it can't be redeemed, but that
Right.
it likely won't be redeemed this side of heaven.
Okay.
And so when I look at redeemed, I know that we participate in redemption,
Mm-hmm.
but it's God who redeems. And when I look at human nature,
Mm-hmm.
without the guardrails of
Right.
a value system that includes anything of God,
Yes.
I end up putting it in.
Okay.
It's God that remains. So.
Okay. And there's a sleeper theological component in all this that we don't have time to spend a lot of time on, but I'll just alert you to it. You made reference to this side of heaven. Some of you are familiar with the term eschatology. And for some of you, that's really energizing. You love eschatology. And for others of you, you think, we've gone off the guardrails too many times, off the rails with eschatology. That's a bunch of nonsense. Jesus is coming back. That's all we need to know. Let's get on with it. Well, let me just say that part of what's at work, particularly down here, is our understanding of eschatology. What is it in God's plan, in God's design? What is it that the future holds? What can we expect between now and when Jesus returns? What can't we expect between now and the time when Jesus returns? And when he does return, what's he going to do? And what does that tell us about maybe the way we ought to be living now? That's a whole class. You could have Pastor Chuck do a month-long series on eschatology and thinking about the future and what the future tells us about the present, because that's part of what's at work here. These two, don't expect much between now and the time Jesus comes back. We're kind of on hold. We're just hanging on by our fingernails until Jesus comes back. Well, that's a particular understanding of God's plan for the world. Well, somebody else from, yes?
That was thinking of abortion in the Romarxist way. I started out with paradox.
Okay.
To say that there's tension is a mild statement.
Right.
There's definitely tension in the world to do with all that.
Mm-hmm.
I thought, me personally, if I were in opposition, I might be one person who would go kill the doctor who did the abortions. I mean, that would be the extreme to which someone might take it there. If I were a synthesist, I might, my body, my choice, would identify with that. It's not right or wrong or different, it's your choice.
Yes.
So then I'm back to the paradox and transformer. I do believe there's a right and wrongness to it.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's where I'm, because it's a life, and to kill that life is, there's, in my brain, there's a wrongness to that.
Yes.
But when I think about, like I've had 3 abortions, spontaneous miscarriages, but I can identify with the person who has miscarried or not miscarried, but had an abortion. I think my personal take would be to get down to the person and ask why, instead of that it's wrong. Why did you have it, and start there so that you're corrupted? I'm not believing that what you did was wrong,
Mm-hmm.
but that you can be redeemed. It's not like it's the end of the world and you're automatically going to hell because you had it.
Or whether you support district attorneys in states prosecuting mothers for going across state lines. That's a less extreme to kill the abortionist, but it's still.
Mm-hmm. Yes, sir.
I was just trying to think about the flow of culture.
Okay.
50 years ago, maybe even earlier than that, we had Billy Graham,
Yes.
and he'd fill up a stadium,
Yes.
and everybody would come to Jesus.
Yes.
Then that sort of falls by the wayside. I
Yep.
don't really see much of anybody doing that. But now
Right.
we have mega churches
Yes.
where they sort of come in one by one, I guess.
Yeah.
I don't know what I'm saying. It's
Well,
just, there's something flowing along here.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, just a couple of notes. You are correct. So, first of all, I'm old enough. I'm knocking on the door of 70. So, which is when I turned 65. When I turned 65, I tried to recalibrate the way I thought about birthdays, which was I just said, and I do believe this. It's getting it down into here, which is that with every year I just have more and more to be thankful for. God has granted me this many years, and I know many good people, friends of mine, who are already in the Lord's presence, who died in their 40s, who died in their 30s, who died a lot younger. And God, in His wisdom, I have to assume, has allowed me to live this long. Well, I digress. To say this, the cultural change of over the last 30 years or so is breathtaking. The speed and the degree of change. And I understand if my 20-something and 30-something friends kind of want to take what I've just said, oh, well, that's all old people think that, right? I mean, and you can go back to the ancient Greeks and Romans and find, older people saying, oh, the world's going to hell in a handbasket. This younger generation is, so we have to be aware that there's just a human tendency that on older generations, they tend to look and think often, things have really gone downhill. That's a quite pervasive phenomenon. Having acknowledged that, I will still say I think I'm enough of a student of history to be able to say this. The changes of the last 30 or 40 years in the United States have been accelerated. They really are quite profound in some fundamental ways. And some of your observations about the shape of evangelicalism, from Billy Graham to megachurch to now, what some of you may or may not be aware of, is the word isn't often used, but a more parish approach to church. I have many, many, many students at the seminary who have no interest in a megachurch. They don't want to be part of a megachurch. They don't have a vision to grow a megachurch. I have numbers of students who are saying, we see this part of town, there's a lot of need there, and what we want to do is we want to minister to this part of town. And they'll give geographic boundaries. I was on an advisory board for a church plant that actually said, this road, this street, and this street. That's where we're aiming. Now, they're not ignoring the rest of the world, but their vision for the church is, well, again, all of those things, from Billy Graham to the megachurch to parish church model, those are cultural. They represent different ways of responding to and engaging the culture, the cultural context. Well, let's just round this out by, I want to complete this with Christ of culture, which is the only view we didn't explicitly talk about last week. So the nickname for this is sometimes the cultural view, cultural Christianity. And the approach is fundamentally agreement. They just don't see a lot of tension, disagreement of any significant sort between the surrounding culture and Christianity. There are various examples of this, which again, I won't go into, won't take time to talk about these, but these are in many ways, you can find this kind of a posture in the course of church history. Some biblical things. Paul seems with great comfort and ease to quote ancient pagan authors in a kind of affirming way to the people gathered at the Areopagus, as recorded in Acts 17, as some of your own poets have said. And he's not raising them in order to put a stick in their eye. He's raising it to say, hey, here's a bit of wisdom worth pondering. And what's the source? Not Jesus. Some of your own poets have said this. There's also then the theological elements of two things called general revelation and common grace. General revelation is basically the idea that God doesn't reveal himself only to Christians. He doesn't reveal himself only to his own people. The heavens declare the glory of God. God knit us together in our mother's wombs. And when he did that, he made us. And what we bear his thumbprint. Now, the question of whether or not people recognize this as, the God of the Bible has done this, that's another matter. But the point is, again, is to take a line from Schaeffer, he is there and he is not silent. God is speaking everywhere. That's general revelation. And then common grace. God sends his rain on who? Only those who follow him. In fact, some of us who follow him wish he'd send more rain on us, right? I mean, he sends his rain on who? The just and the unjust. Common grace. God gives life to people. There are people who
defy God and yet have great physical health, great worldly success, and some are even, quote unquote, pretty good people. I know some pretty good non-Christians who are more sensitive and caring and polite to other people than some of my Christian friends are. Right? The good, fundamental underlying goodness of creation. This isn't a Christian chair. It's not a Christian chair. It's a chair. And anybody who wants a chair, whether they're a Christian or not, can sit in this chair and benefit from it. There's nothing Christian about it. And there's, in this view, there's very limited impact, if any, of the fall. This view does not see human beings as fundamentally broken and evil. That's not how they view. So as part of creation, very, very limited, if any, impact of this thing that many of us refer to as the fall. And because of that, you're able to look at culture and not see the relationship between Christianity and culture as fundamentally one of tension or opposition or conflict, but, hey, this is God's world. We're all children of God. Theologically, that is a correct statement. Every human being is a child of God. It's a theologically true statement. So, assessment of culture. Culturally is good. There's little or no tension in formulating Christian thought and life in relation to culture. We can go with the culture and not feel like we're going away from Christ, or because, again, this is God's work in the world. So, and if you're reading Carson's book, by the way, what you're going to find is Carson's not a fan of this. He doesn't really commend this, but he feels the need to interact with it because of how influential, for good or ill, this has been. And what I want to do now is to give a little bit of twist to this, at least as Niebuhr originally intended it, and as many people have used it. The first thing I've done is to reorder it, sequence it, in kind of a progression through these 5. But the other observation that many people have noted, and now I want to come back to your reference to parts of culture, is that if we look at this, no one, including the historical figures that Niebuhr talked about, and none of us live all the time in every arena of our life in any one of these categories. We, not consciously, we mix and match. Sometimes we relate this way, sometimes that way. So it's not a question of figure out which one of these is the right one and then live your whole life within it. Personally, I think a better use of this is to view it as what I sometimes call a menu of possibilities, of different ways, because each of them has some truth to it. Each of them reflects certain streams of biblical teaching, certain theological truths, and there are probably, I'm not saying that we'll equally use all 5, but what I'm suggesting, and I'll illustrate in a minute, I want to give you a chance to comment here. I'll just say in a minute, I'll give you some illustrations of how I, because I'll use myself there, don't always operate in any one of these categories. But what would you like to say?
To what extent is personality involved? Because if you're on the left side of the thing here, you're a person who wants things nailed down, so
Yep,
you don't
yep.
have to deal with messy stuff.
Yeah,
The further you go to the right, the messier it gets.
yeah,
And I think of art. In our coffee shop, we have student art, and one of the pictures in there is jarring to me because it's very similar to some demonic expressions of art.
okay,
And the way I look at that is that if you're going to have student art, you're going to take some big risks, and you're going to have some stuff that's marginal.
yep,
You've got to be willing to live with the messiness.
Yep.
And the illustration of Jesus that helps is the two instances where he let women anoint his feet with oil.
Mhm.
Well, the one prostitute one goes way off the charts in terms of what I would feel comfortable with.
yes,
And he's embracing cultural stuff
Yes.
that I can see what the Pharisees were.
Yep.
They're on the side that everything about the pagan culture and Roman culture is bad, and Jesus just went way over the line.
yep, yep. Well, at the risk, so I'm not a psychologist. You asked the question, to what extent does kind of personality, or another related term might be temperament, come into this? It's very significant. Just to cite one thing, there is something in the field of psychology called tolerance for ambiguity, which is part of what you were talking about. Tolerance for ambiguity. And just by personality and temperament, different people have differing tolerances for ambiguity.